The city was dead, a graveyard of steel and fire, where the wind carried the ghosts of a world that once was. Somewhere in the ruins, a rusted engine growled to life, its roar slicing through the silence like a battle cry. It wasn't supposed to run, nothing was. The invaders had seen to that. They had torn apart Earth's machines, crushed its armies, and left its people scattered like ashes in the wind. And yet, inside the wreckage of an old auto shop, one man stood defiant. Frank Mercer, a mechanic with nothing left to lose, tightened his grip on the wheel. The warlords thought humanity was finished, that there was no fight left in them. They were wrong. The engine screamed louder. And this time it wasn't just noise. It was revenge. Before we start, please, subscribe the channel by clicking card button on top right corner and hit the notification bell so you can get daily stories at bedtime. Let's dive in the story. The air smelled of rust and old smoke, a city of steel and fire drowning in silence. Once, it had been Los Angeles. Now, it was a graveyard of shattered skyscrapers and twisted highways. The war had lasted years. Humanity fought, but the invaders were stronger, faster, deadlier. Frank Mercer wiped the sweat from his brow, his fingers smeared with grease and blood. His knuckles were bruised, his shirt torn at the sleeves. He stood in the ruins of what used to be Mercer's auto repair, his father's old shop, the only place left standing for miles. The metal beams groaned under their own weight, and half the ceiling had collapsed, leaving a jagged hole where the sun peeked through like a watchful eye. A storm was coming. He could feel it in the air, thick and charged like a live wire. But that wasn't what made him uneasy. It was the silence. Then came the thud, a heavy footstep, then another, and another. Frank exhaled sharply, wiping his hands on his jeans. He had known this moment would come. From the shattered remains of an old freeway, they emerged tall, armored figures with dark green scales gleaming under the pale sky. The Hekari, warlords of another world. One of them, larger than the rest, stepped forward. His plated armor bore the deep scars of countless battles. His eyes, sharp and golden, locked onto Frank with something close to amusement. This was General Scar, the Butcher of Earth. "You have nowhere left to run, human," Scar hissed, his voice a jagged whisper, like metal scraping against metal. Frank didn't move. He flexed his fingers, feeling the tension in his joints. His eyes flicked toward the rusted car behind him, the one he'd spent the last 5 years rebuilding. Scar took another step closer, his clawed feet cracking the pavement beneath him. "You are weak. You cling to broken things." Frank smirked, shaking his head. "Yeah? Well, broken things can still bite." The warlord's lips curled back, revealing rows of sharp teeth. "You think your rusted metal will save you?" Frank turned toward the wrecked muscle car, its frame dented and scarred but still standing. He ran his hand over its hood, feeling the rough, patched-up surface. It wasn't just a car. It was something else, something new. With a flick of his wrist, he turned the key. The engine roared to life, shaking the ground beneath them. A sound so powerful, so defiant, it sent a ripple of unease through the warriors behind Scar. Their tails flicked, their hands tightening around their weapons. Frank grinned. "You were saying?" The warlord's golden eyes narrowed. The machine growled. Its heartbeat synced with the mechanic's own. The war wasn't over. Not yet. The roar of the engine sent a shockwave through the battlefield of broken streets and crumbling buildings. Dust lifted off the ground, swirling around the rusted beast Frank had spent years building in the shadows of war. The Hekari warriors flinched at the sound, their clawed hands tightening around their weapons. They had destroyed Earth's technology, burned its cities, crushed its armies. But here was a machine that should not be running. Frank saw the flicker of unease in their golden eyes. He smirked. "Didn't think humans could build something without your permission, huh?" Scar tilted his head slightly, studying him with reptilian patience. "No matter how loud your machine screams, human, it will fall like the rest of your kind," the warlord said. "You are playing with pieces of a dead world." Frank placed both hands on the hood of his car, feeling the deep vibrations beneath his palms. This wasn't just a car. It was a monster of steel and fire, built from scraps of the old world and stolen pieces of the new. Beneath its rusted shell were alien parts. Powerful, dangerous, barely held together by human stubbornness and a little bit of madness. He leaned forward, lowering his voice just enough to make Scar's slitted pupils shrink. "Then why do you look nervous?" Before the warlord could answer, Frank slammed his fist onto the red ignition switch. The machine howled. Tires screeched as the beast lurched forward, kicking up dust and rubble. The front grille, reinforced with scavenged alien plating, collided with the nearest Hekari warrior. The impact sent the creature flying backward, his armor crunching against the remains of an old street lamp. The other warriors reacted instantly, raising their weapons, preparing to fire. "Open fire," one of them snarled. Frank gritted his teeth and yanked the steering wheel, sending the car into a hard left drift. Plasma bolts whizzed past him, scorching the ground. The engine let out a guttural snarl, the custom-built exhaust system releasing bursts of fire as the car spun through the battlefield like a charging bull. Another warrior lunged forward, his bladed spear aimed at the driver's side. Frank didn't hesitate. He slammed a hidden switch on the dashboard. The left door ejected outward, hitting the warrior square in the chest and sending him tumbling into the dirt. "Should have seen that one coming," Frank shouted over the chaos. Scar didn't move. He stood there, watching, his golden eyes unblinking as the machine tore through his ranks. Frank could feel his gaze, cold and calculating, as if he was measuring every second, waiting for something. Then, without warning, the warlord moved. Too fast. Before Frank could react, Scar leaped forward, his massive body soaring through the air. His claws extended, his tail snapping behind him like a whip. Frank's stomach dropped. Oh hell. Scar landed on top of the car, his claws punching through the roof with a sickening crunch. The metal groaned under his weight. The warlord leaned forward, his face inches from Frank's. "Let's see if your machine can survive a real fight." Metal screeched as Scar's claws punched through the roof, the weight of the warlord pressing down on the car like a boulder. The machine swerved, nearly spinning out of control as Frank wrestled with the wheel. The reinforced frame groaned, but it held for now. Frank gritted his teeth, glancing up at the rearview mirror. All he could see was the warlord's snarling, reptilian face staring right back at him, golden eyes burning with rage. "You're scratching the paint, big guy," Frank muttered, twisting the wheel hard to the right. The car jerked violently, nearly tossing Scar off. But the warlord was faster than Frank had expected. He dug his claws in deeper, anchoring himself to the roof like a parasite. "Pathetic," Scar hissed. "You think this machine makes you powerful?" Frank's knuckles turned white on the wheel. "Nah," he shot back. "I think this machine makes me dangerous." With a quick flick of his wrist, Frank slammed a hidden lever beneath the dashboard. A panel on the car's hood snapped open, revealing a set of makeshift thrusters scavenged from alien tech. He pressed the trigger. Boom! The thrusters ignited, spewing blue-hot flames straight into the sky. The sudden burst of force sent the car into a barrel roll, flipping violently. The whole world spun, once, twice, 3 times before the machine crashed down hard onto the pavement. Scar was thrown off, skidding across the cracked asphalt like a stone over water. He hit the remains of an old highway barrier, shattering it into dust. Frank coughed, his head smacking against the headrest. The inside of the car spun for a second before his vision cleared. His heart was hammering. That move had been risky. Too risky. But it had worked. Or so he thought. The moment he turned his head, he saw it. Scar was already getting back up. Dust rolled off his massive frame as he straightened, his emerald scales scorched but unbroken. His armor, cracked at the shoulders, still clung to him like an extension of his body. He rolled his neck, a sickening pop echoing in the empty streets. "Impressive," he growled, "but foolish." Frank exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You lizards sure like to talk." He revved the engine, letting it snarl like a caged beast. Scar narrowed his eyes. Then he charged. Frank didn't think. He didn't hesitate. He just punched the gas. The car launched forward, tires screeching, the engine howling like a dying storm. The warlord was fast, faster than anything human. But Frank's machine was faster. They collided head-on. Metal met flesh. A deafening crash shook the ruins of the city. Frank's world went black for half a second. Then came the silence. Thick, heavy, wrong. He blinked. Scar was still standing. The front of the car was dented, smoking, barely holding together. And Scar? He was smiling, unharmed. Frank's stomach twisted. Now the warlord hissed, stepping forward. It's my turn. Frank's pulse hammered in his ears as he stared at the impossible sight before him. The impact should have crushed bones, shattered ribs, done something, but Scar stood there unscathed. The warlord rolled his shoulders, his thick muscles rippling under his scorched armor. His golden eyes burned with amusement, as if Frank's best shot had been nothing more than an inconvenience. You disappoint me, human, Scar growled, taking a slow step forward. I expected more fight, more desperation. Frank gritted his teeth. His hands clenched around the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Give me a minute, he muttered. I'm still processing the part where you didn't explode. Scar's lip curled into something almost resembling a smirk. A predator amused by its prey. Your machines, your weapons, your cities, all broken things, he said, his voice dripping with cold certainty. And you? You were just another piece of wreckage left behind. Frank punched a switch on the dashboard. Bzzzzzt. Electricity surged through the car's frame, coursing up through the metal, straight into the warlord's body. Scar's armor lit up in a violent crackle of blue energy. His muscles locked, his body jerking as the surge tore through his nervous system. The air filled with the sharp scent of burnt ozone and scorched scales. Frank watched, breath held, waiting for him to collapse. But instead, Scar laughed. A deep, guttural, inhuman sound. His body trembled, not from pain, but from something far worse. Excitement. With a sudden, violent snarl, he ripped his claws free from the car's hood, snapping off the metal where it had fused from the heat. His golden eyes gleamed through the smoke, alive with fire. You think pain weakens me, he rasped, his voice like gravel scraping across steel. No, human, pain makes me stronger. Frank's stomach dropped. Scar moved too fast to react. His claws slashed through the windshield, grabbing Frank by the collar before he could even think to reach for his weapon. Then, R.I.P. The warlord tore him straight out of the car, like peeling meat from bone. Frank's world spun as he crashed into the pavement, pain exploding across his back and shoulders. His lungs screamed for air, his ribs aching from the impact. He tried to move, to scramble backward, but a massive foot slammed onto his chest, pinning him down. Scar loomed over him, shadowed against the burning sky. No more games, mechanic, he growled. No more machines. No more tricks. Frank coughed, tasting blood in his mouth. All right. He wheezed, blinking up at him. No more tricks. Then, with the last ounce of strength in his body, he reached into his jacket and pressed the detonator. The car exploded. The explosion tore through the streets, a thunderous shockwave of fire and shrapnel ripping apart the night. The force flung Frank backward, sending him tumbling across the cracked asphalt like a rag doll. His ears rang, drowning out the world in a high-pitched whine. Heat licked at his skin, the air thick with smoke and the acrid stench of burning metal. He hit the ground hard, rolling to a stop near a pile of rubble. His body screamed in protest, but he pushed through the pain, forcing himself up onto his elbows. His vision swam, but he could still make out the smoldering wreckage where his car had been. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, a shadow moved within the flames. Frank's stomach twisted into a cold knot. No way. The fire parted, and Scar stepped through. His armor was shattered, his scales blackened and smoking, but he was still standing. His breath came in deep, ragged growls, steam hissing off his burned skin. His golden eyes, once sharp with amusement, now burned with pure fury. You dare, Scar rasped, his voice like grinding stone. Frank wiped the blood from his mouth, forcing himself to his feet. His knees shook, his entire body aching, but he managed to grin. Gotta admit, he coughed, thought that would do more. Scar snarled, his massive frame tensing like a coiled predator. I have endured wars that lasted centuries, mechanic. Your little firecracker. He flexed his claws, the metal tips gleaming under the flames. It was a spark in the wind. Frank's smirk faltered. He was out of options. No car, no weapons, just his fists and whatever stubbornness was keeping him upright. Scar saw it, the flicker of doubt, and he laughed, a deep, guttural sound that sent chills racing down Frank's spine. Look at you, the warlord sneered, stepping forward. All that fight, all that defiance. He raised a massive clawed hand, the sharp tips gleaming in the firelight. And in the end, you die just like the rest of your kind. The claw swung down. Frank dodged. Barely. The tips slashed across his shoulder, searing pain ripping through his body as he stumbled backward. He bit back a cry, clutching the wound as warm blood soaked his sleeve. Scar didn't let up. He came at him again, striking with blinding speed. Frank ducked, twisting to the side as the warlord's fist shattered the pavement where he'd been standing. Dust and debris exploded around them. Think, Frank. Think. His mind raced, searching for something, anything, to turn the tide. Then his eyes locked onto something in the wreckage. Something small, something glowing. The power core. His heart jumped into his throat. It was still intact. If he could get to it, Scar lunged, his claws aimed straight for Frank's throat. Frank dove for the core. Frank hit the ground hard, his fingers scrambling through the debris. His vision blurred from pain, but he had no time for weakness. The power core was right there, humming with unstable energy, pulsing with a dim blue glow beneath the wreckage. Behind him, Scar's snarl deepened, the sound reverberating through the broken city like a warning. The warlord's clawed foot crashed down, missing Frank by inches and splintering the pavement where his head had been moments ago. Enough of this, Scar bellowed, his voice raw with fury. You will not crawl away like a rat. Frank's fingers closed around the core. Heat burned through his gloves, sending sharp pain up his arm. The thing was overheating. It wasn't built to be handled like this. But he had no choice. With a sharp twist, he ripped it free from the tangle of metal. Sparks burst into the air, and the once dim glow flared blindingly bright. Scar froze, his golden eyes locked onto the core, his snarl faltering for a fraction of a second. And that was all Frank needed. He whipped around, gripping the core in both hands. The energy inside it throbbed, unstable, on the verge of detonating. He could feel it. This thing was a bomb waiting to go off. Hey, lizard! Frank shouted, his breath ragged. Scar's eyes snapped back to him, his pupils narrowing. Frank grinned through the pain. Catch! He threw it. The core spun through the air, the blue light pulsing faster. Scar's instincts kicked in. His reflexes, faster than any human, made him snatch at mid-air without hesitation. But the second his clawed fingers closed around it, he knew he had made a mistake. A high-pitched whine filled the air, growing louder, sharper. The core pulsed violently, flickering white-hot in the warlord's grasp. Scar's expression shifted. For the first time in this fight, he looked uncertain. What? He muttered, staring down at the energy sphere in his palm. Frank wiped the blood from his lips, his breaths heavy. I rigged it, he said, voice hoarse. Scar's eyes snapped up. The core detonated. A shockwave of pure, blinding energy ripped through the ruins, consuming everything in its path. The impact sent Frank flying, his body flipping through the air like a discarded puppet before slamming into a collapsed building. Darkness swallowed his vision. His ears rang. His chest ached. He could taste dust and blood on his tongue. Slowly, painfully, he forced his head up. The battlefield was silent. Scar was gone, or at least what was left of him. Smoke curled through the ruins, thick and suffocating. The air was still charged with static, remnants of the explosion crackling against the metal husks of destroyed buildings. Frank lay on his back, his entire body numb, staring at the sky, if it could even be called that anymore. The once blue heavens were now nothing but a dull, ashen gray, choked by the scars of war. His ears still rang, drowning out the world in an endless hum. His chest ached with every breath, ribs protesting against the sheer force of what had just happened. He tried to move, but his muscles screamed in defiance. He forced himself to sit up, wincing as a fresh wave of pain ripped through him. Dust stuck to his sweat-soaked skin, mixing with the blood that dripped from a gash above his brow. His vision blurred, but he could still see the massive crater where Scar had stood just moments ago. Nothing was left. No body. No automat. Just ashes scattered across the wind. Frank let out a shaky breath, his hands resting on his knees. "Guess you weren't as indestructible as you thought," he muttered, wiping the blood from his mouth. Silence answered him. For the first time in years, there was no war cry, no battle horns, no alien footsteps shaking the earth. Just the sound of the wind moving through a broken city. He let his head tilt back, exhaustion crashing over him like a tidal wave. His car was gone, reduced to scrap. His body felt like it had been through hell and back. And yet, he was alive. A sound in the distance made him stiffen. His instincts flared, trained from years of survival. He reached for his belt, only to find nothing. No gun, no tools, just his bare hands and a body held together by sheer spite. The noise came again. Footsteps. Soft, careful, human. Frank turned his head, his pulse pounding. Through the smoke, a group of figures emerged. Their clothes were tattered, their faces streaked with dirt and exhaustion, but their eyes were sharp, alive, defiant. Survivors. A man, stocky with a thick beard, stepped forward first. He held a makeshift rifle, but it wasn't pointed at Frank. He studied him, glancing at the crater, then back. "That was you?" he asked, voice rough but filled with something else. Something that had been missing for too long. "Hope." Frank exhaled, running a hand through his dirty hair. "Yeah," he muttered. "That was me." A woman stepped forward next, her eyes flicking to the burned-out battlefield, then back at him. "Is it over?" she asked, voice almost fragile, as if saying the words might shatter them. Frank looked at the sky, at the empty, silent horizon where no more warships loomed. No more monsters. No more warlords. He let out a tired, lopsided grin. "Damn right it is." The group exchanged glances, their expressions shifting, some to disbelief, others to relief. A few even laughed, the sound raw and unfamiliar, as if they had forgotten what it was like to believe in tomorrow. Frank let himself sink back onto the pavement, staring at the sky again. The war was over, and for the first time in a long, long time, humanity had won. Here is the story ends. If you enjoyed and want to watch more thrilling sci-fi adventures, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Dive into epic battles, explore distant galaxies, and join brave heroes as they fight for survival against impossible odds. Let us know in comments if you want next chapters to publish soon. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and become part of the journey. Together, we'll keep the last light burning. Subscribe now and let the adventure continue. Here is the story ends. If you enjoyed and want to watch more thrilling sci-fi adventures, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Dive into epic battles, explore distant galaxies, and join brave heroes as they fight for survival against impossible odds. Let us know in comments if you want next chapters to publish soon. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and become part of the journey. Together, we'll keep the last light burning. Subscribe now and let the adventure continue.